Welcome back. I'm Randy Cross, and this is Unsafe Spaces, Season 2. Got a good episode for you this week. We're bringing back a former guest, Brittany Hughes, who's the managing editor of MRCTV. Go to mrctv.org for more information, articles, and videos and whatnot on her and the normal group of happiness that we always have. We'll have our Wambulance, we'll have our feel-good story, we'll have our unsafe sports, everything else. We will not disappoint, but let's catch back up real quick and remind you who Brittany Hughes is.
No, the Trump administration did not lose 1,500 immigrant kids. They aren't ripping children away from their mothers or keeping children in dog kennels. And if you have bought into the media's lies about all of this, listen up. The left spent the weekend blasting the Trump administration for its handling of illegal aliens at the border, accusing him of losing children, tearing apart families, and keeping children in cages like dogs. And surprise, they're lying. For those of you who have not been paying attention since like 2013, here's how this works. Unaccompanied kids come across the border and get stopped by border agents. They're processed and turned over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Then they're sent to sponsors who already live in the United States. Most of these sponsors are the kids' parents or close relatives. The vast majority of the sponsors are illegal. They don't want to get deported, so they don't show up for the kids' court date. Instead, they move, so the government can't find them. The administration is not losing kids. The kids and their families aren't staying put. How do I know all of this? Because I was writing about it 4 years ago when it was happening under Obama. Where was your outrage back in 2016? Actually, why haven't you been concerned with the thousands of kids who slipped through the cracks for the past half a decade? The Trump administration has placed about 16,000 kids with sponsors this fiscal year. Obama placed over 52,000 in 2014 alone, and home visits were conducted for less than 6%. Where was all of your righteous indignation then?
So just as a reminder, that's Brittany Hughes, never short on opinions, and we'll have a lot to talk about, especially a short list of current events that I've gleaned not only from her site, but from news events of the day over the last 2 or 3 days. Let's go now to the commentary section of this podcast. My commentary, but this week, my commentary won't be exceedingly long because, my commentary when it comes to politics, I don't share too much. It's not hard to guess at times, but I do have a go-to guy for common sense. And I do have a go-to guy for kind of a voice of reason. And I do have a go-to guy for, honestly, when I just kind of want to laugh. Now, the language at times in here, it gets a little dicey. But why in the hell would you go see George Carlin if being a little dicey offended you?
Whenever you're exposed to advertising in this country, you realize all over again that America's leading industry is still the manufacture, distribution, packaging, and marketing of bullshit. High-quality bullshit. World-class designer bullshit, to be sure. Hospital-tested, clinically proven bullshit. But bullshit nonetheless. And it always amuses me that so many people seem to think that bullshit only comes from certain sources. Advertising, politicians, salesmen. Not true. Bullshit is everywhere. Bullshit is rampant. Parents are full of shit. Teachers are full of shit. Clergymen are full of shit. Law enforcement people are full of shit. The entire country is completely full of shit. In fact, this country was founded by a group of slave owners who told us that all men are created equal. That is what's known as being stunningly full of shit. And I think, people show their ignorance when they say they want politicians to be honest. What are these people talking about? If honesty were suddenly introduced into politics, it would throw everything off. The whole system would collapse. And I think deep down the American people know that. The American people like their bullshit out front, where they can get a good, strong whiff of it. That's why they reelected Clinton. Listen, Clinton might be full of shit, but he lets you know it. Dole tried to hide it. I'm an honest man. Bullshit. Bullshit. People don't believe that shit. Clinton said, hi, I'm full of shit, and how do you like that? And the people said, at least he's honest. At least he's honest about being full of shit. It's like the business world. All businessmen are completely full of shit. Just the worst kind of people you could ever want to run into. Businessmen. And the proof of it is, they don't even trust each other. They don't trust each other. When a businessman is negotiating a deal, the first thing he does is to automatically assume that the other guy is a complete lying prick who's trying to fuck him on the deal. So he has to do everything he can to fuck the other guy a little bit harder and a little bit faster. And then, when it comes to dealing with customers, that's when you get the big smile. That's when you get the big smile. Businessman always has that big smile on his face as he carefully positions himself directly behind the customer and unzips his pants and services the account.
I hope you're like me and you just love George Carlin, because honestly, a lot of that makes sense. And it's pretty topical considering it came from 7 to 10 years ago. But now, as promised, we're going to be joined by Brittany Hughes, who's the host of Reality Check on MRCTV. Go to mrctv.org for that. She's also the managing editor. All right, here we go. As promised, we are joined by the host of Reality Check and the managing editor at MRCTV, Brittany Hughes. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me. I love being here.
Great. Hey, you know what? I've been going through not only some of your stuff there at MRCTV, but obviously it has not exactly been a slow news cycle over the last 5 to 7 days. I'd love to go through this little, I've got a mini pile here of news stories and just sort of on a subject by subject basis, kind of get your thoughts. You ready to go?
Fire away.
Fantastic. Let's do this. Number one on most people's list, especially over the last 48 hours, is the Supreme Court and the upholding the Trump travel ban. From a realistic standpoint, what did that decision accomplish? And is there any explanation as to why this suddenly is something that's being put on a par with the KKK and Nazis and other things like this? How do we go from 0 to 1,000 like that?
Because the left has lost their minds. And I think you've seen that over the past couple of weeks when it comes to things like immigration. I mean, look, you disagree with the left on any policy issue at this point, and you're immediately a Nazi. You're basically Hitler. And it kind of loses its punch after a while when that's their response to everything. Here's the thing about the so-called travel ban, all right? It limits on various bases the people who can travel from 7 different countries, okay? And it's different for each country. Some of them restricts people who are coming across to immigrate, so people who are coming across to stay permanently. Others, it restricts more broadly. It depends on it's country by country. But it includes 5 Muslim-majority nations, Venezuela, and North Korea. And it's because the State Department has said that these are countries that are at higher risks of terror infiltrations. And by the way, these are the same countries that were on the Obama administration's list that they wanted to restrict travel from, but you don't hear about that part because, this is all about hating President Trump. And so what the Supreme Court essentially did yesterday was they upheld that the president does have the constitutional right to limit travel into the United States. That's what the Supreme Court ultimately said. As long as he does not infringe on the Constitution in some other way, in doing so, he has the power to do exactly what he's doing. The reason that the left is freaking out is because they want to label this as a Muslim ban because it's a good way to call him a racist. It's not a Muslim ban. Only 5 countries on this list are Muslim majority nations. There are about 50 Muslim majority nations in the world. This restricts travel on various bases from about a tenth of those countries.
Mm-hmm.
So the vast majority of Muslims in the world can come to the United States just fine, obviously according to our policies, but they can come just fine. So to call this a Muslim ban is not only false, but incredibly, incredibly deceptive, a way to basically label him as Islamophobic. So that's what you're seeing happen on the left now.
Is it oversimplifying the subject to basically say, the ruling said, look, if you can't verify people, the president has the right to say, okay, we're going to back down on the immigration from this country. And the other thing is, it's got nothing to do with intent and what you're thinking between your ears as you're writing something. It's exactly what the law, what the bill, what the statement said. It's got nothing to do with something that you might be thinking.
No, and the other thing, too, that people need to understand is these countries, it's not just that we can't verify who these travelers are. It's that these specific countries lack systems in place to verify on their end. Mm-hmm. And so there's a partnership that has to happen between us and the sending country wherein they verify who their people are and they've got documentation, and that way we can verify who they are through their systems. These are countries that don't have those systems in place, or they have systems that don't go far enough and we're uncomfortable with them. So it's not just that, we can verify somebody from Afghanistan, but not Iran. It's that Iran does not have the system in place that allows us to verify those people. And we're saying until you get that under control and we know who you're sending, we're going to restrict travel because we don't know if this is a good person, if this is a bad person, if they mean to do us harm. That's why you're seeing certain countries on this list and not others.
All right. And something else in that Supreme Court decision that for some reason hasn't gotten much coverage, that it was included or even mentioned in that decision. One of the, I guess, sort of blights on the reputation of our country was back in the 40s. There was a Supreme Court decision called Korematsu versus USA, and it had to do with the Japanese American citizens, the Japanese Americans that were put in internment camps. And this decision, as part of that yesterday by the Supreme Court, it didn't overturn it, but it rejected the whole idea of Korematsu versus the USA. Why aren't more people making a big deal out of that? Because that really separates a lot of these things when it comes to immigration and it comes to even your own people, that rightfully so, we need to separate and push back and get away from as much as possible.
A lot of times people, that's the problem, though, is they don't want to separate it. It's the same thing, if I can make a comparison here, it's the same thing that you've seen with immigration over the last couple of weeks, where if you say that we have a detention facility that is holding people and holding families because we're trying to figure out who they are and whether they have a reason to stay in the United States, well, if you take an aerial shot of a detention facility and it's got a roof and a barbed wire fence, well, now all of a sudden it's Auschwitz, and the border agents are basically the Gestapo, and these are basically concentration camps. I mean, we've literally heard these places compared to concentration camps simply because they are detainment facilities. They are not concentration camps. We're not gassing people or working them to death or beating them to death. They're not emaciated. It's ridiculous. And anybody who's ever picked up a history book would understand that.
Yeah.
But, there's this quick comparison being made with the travel ban to policies that we had in World War II that have since been ruled, unconstitutional, and the fact that they happened is egregious and is a black mark on our history. But in hindsight, looking at it in hindsight. But this is nothing close to Japanese internment camps. This is nothing close to what we did back then.
I agree.
And to say so is to be ignorant of history, but they're not looking at the facts. They don't want to understand it that way. Yeah. They want to make a quick apples to oranges comparison.
Brittany, those were Americans They happen to be of Japanese.
Absolutely.
They happen to be of Japanese heritage, but those were Japanese Americans. We, FDR and the American government, put those people in internment camps.
Yes.
This wasn't illegal immigrants.
And that's exactly the difference. I mean, well, one of the many differences. But people, again, the left is not looking to see that. The media is not looking to see that. There's no understanding of, okay, look, this really is an apples and oranges comparison. These two things are not the same. It's a quick and easy label to slap on. It becomes a nice little catchphrase in order to make Donald Trump look like a giant racist and to make all of his voters look like giant racists. That's the end goal here. It's not to ferret out the facts. It's not to actually have an understanding of what's going on. It's to brand him with certain labels to make him seem xenophobic, like he hates people from other countries, like he hates people with other skin colors, and so do all of his 63 million plus voters. They're all a bunch of racists. And this, I think, is something that is it would be fascinating to watch on the right if it weren't so sad and so terrifying. This idea that a large segment of our country has completely neglected facts and completely thrown out, logical thinking in order to buy into a narrative where they've come up with their conclusion, and then they formulate a hypothesis that fits it. Is what we're seeing here. And I think that does a huge disservice because this is not a Muslim ban at all. And if you understood how many Muslim countries there are in the world, that would be very easy to see. That's not a partisan thing.
Yeah.
That's just a fact.
Yeah, if you're going to do that, Indonesia would be pretty close to the top of that list, and they are not on that list.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, my former state, they might be onto something here. I'd love to get your thoughts on a news story that hit the other day. California it's been proposed out there, a state bill. It's a 1424 to the California Senate. They would like to form a government-run group to monitor fake news. What could possibly go wrong with this?
So I live out here in California, not for very long, actually. My husband is in the military, so we're out here. And it's been an eye-opening experience for sure, I will tell you. And this is just the latest in a bunch of wacky things that California has decided to push. There's no saying that it's going to pass necessarily. It's sitting in the Senate right now, the state Senate. But it is a bill that would mandate that the government create a fake news advisory board. So essentially a public-private partnership where you have a board that would then come up with definitions of fake news. They're supposed to study what is fake news and come up with a plan to stop it on social media sites. So, of course, a lot of these social media sites are based out of California. You got, Facebook and Google and all. And so what could possibly go wrong with the government getting involved in determining what is and isn't fake news and what should and shouldn't be disseminated? It's not like we've ever seen that before in human history, and it's ended terribly. Yeah. Oh, wait, yes, it has. It's also interesting to see who they want to put on this panel. They've got heads of social media.
But Brittany, realistically, isn't this one of those subjects that you look at? Your common sense side of your brain goes, you know what, that is a good idea. We do need something. But then you start looking at implementing that, and it's like 1984 Big Brother, and everything else just drips off of it.
Well, so you do need something, and I can tell you exactly what you need. You need an educated populace that can understand information and can think for themselves. That's what you need. You need people to go back to a time when people had gray matter between their ears and didn't necessarily believe something just because freedomeagle.facebook told them or because their grandma told them or whatever. So if you had a populace that actually cared to learn, and I think a lot of us do, you wouldn't have so much of this problem. What we don't need is government intervention. There's a big difference, and here's one of the biggest problems that I have. This idea that every time there's an issue, every time there's a problem that we need to solve, that it's the government's job to solve it. That is not true. Oftentimes when the government steps in to solve a legitimate problem, they end up just creating 5 more problems. So I do think that fake news is something that should be addressed in our society. I don't trust the government to do it. And I think that creates a whole lot of incentive for the government to be able to come in and to manipulate what they do and don't want people to hear, and what they do and don't want people to believe. The other issue that you have that a lot of free speech organizations are now saying about this California bill is that that regardless of whether or not a piece of news is fake, it could be as fake as the day is long. But you start having free speech issues come into play when the government comes in and says you can't say that because it's incorrect. Well, our Constitution doesn't have a clause for whether or not information is correct or not. It simply says that you have free speech. So for the government to crack down on something just because it's fake, it being fake isn't necessarily a good thing, obviously, but it's not within the government's purview to come in and say you can't say it because it's fake.
Yeah, that it's the definition of a can of worms.
It's a huge can of worms. And, and they did try to pass a bill that was similar to this before. They tried to pass a bill that actually would have required schools to teach students the difference between real and fake news, and that failed, thank God, because, then, of course, you're funneling it through their little indoctrination centers. That's also terrible.
Well, that's basically what schools are these days. Along those lines, what'd you think of that, the congressional intern, the congressman from New Hampshire, whose intern screamed basically, it starts with F and ends in U, to President Trump when he was at the Capitol last week? I mean, they disciplined the hell out of her. She got suspended for a week.
She did get suspended for a week. So, unfortunately, I'm not surprised by this because we have, as you've seen with, the whole Maxine Waters situation this week, you have a complete and total breakdown of civility and decorum in this country in a way that I don't remember seeing. This intern, there was a cell phone footage taken of her basically screaming F you at President Trump as he walked into a meeting. I believe he was meeting with Paul Ryan and a couple of other folks on immigration. And she got suspended for a week. It doesn't surprise me that somebody would scream that in the halls of Congress these days, sadly. I will say, had this been an intern for a Republican lawmaker and had that been President Obama walking through, the reaction would have been completely different. First of all, it would have gotten a lot more media coverage than it did. And she probably would have been branded a racist and every kind of phobia under the sun just simply for saying those words. And she would have been fired. The fact that she was just suspended tells me a lot about if you don't like Donald Trump, whatever, if you don't respect Donald Trump, whatever, a lot of people don't, but he is the president of the United States. That is, the office of the president commands a certain amount of respect regardless of who's sitting in the Oval Office. And it tells me a lot about how the left side of the aisle in Congress thinks about that office at all when they're willing to have one of their interns scream something foul right there in the halls of Congress at the president to his face, and they just suspend her for a week. That tells me a lot. And it tells me that they probably wouldn't have suspended her if there hadn't been at least a small outcry. If nobody had made a big deal out of it, she probably wouldn't have gotten anything at all.
Or a cell phone video. If there's no video, it didn't happen. If it isn't in a selfie or a cell phone video these days, it didn't really happen.
Exactly. It's kind of the tree that falls in the forest. Fortunately, we do have cell phone footage, so we can see a lot of things that happen, which, it's both a good and bad thing depending on how you look at it these days. But
well, you mentioned Maxine Waters and her little riff, and I've got a little something on that later on. But it has ratcheted up people's feelings. And last time you were on, we sort of discussed, the whole thing that everything goes from 0 to FU in like nanoseconds when it comes to a conversation. But now you're seeing things that are different. These confrontations, these literally getting into people's faces, getting into their space, if you will, personal space. And then there was actually an incident, a burnt headless animal carcass left on a DHS official's porch. Something like this happens when you've got elected officials out there actually encouraging people to confront and not saying violence, but do you really have to explain it to them after the whole Steve Scalise thing? Don't you know that people escalate and interpret things pretty differently?
Well, I think the fact that we just commemorated just a couple weeks ago the 1-year anniversary of that congressional baseball game where Steve Scalise almost lost his life, I think is not lost on a lot of people. Look, we've had contentious times in American history before. I'm 29 years old. I barely remember the Clinton years myself, but I remember my parents getting into heated discussions with people over, Clinton versus Bob Dole and things like that. But it wasn't like what it is today. I don't remember a time. Well, I mean, you always had your crazies. You always had your people on the fringe of both parties who did wackadoodle stuff. And when they did it, the rest of the party would come out and be like, oh, well, we reject that and that's bad. And people weren't widely calling for violence. Now, though, you have a media that is intentionally whipping people into a frenzy, and they'll use fake news to do it. They'll use fabricated photos of crying toddlers at the border and make up stories about them if it means getting people all hyped up with anger and hatred and emotion. You can't be a political pundit and sit there on national television and call Donald Trump Hitler and say that he's putting people in concentration camps without knowing what you're doing. You have liberal lawmakers like Maxine Waters standing there and essentially saying whenever a member of the Trump administration steps out their front door, harass them until they can't stand it anymore. Don't let them go to gas stations and grocery stores and restaurants. I mean, this is no longer just simply let's disagree with one another. We can even get heated about it. But then at the end of the day, we all share the same oxygen and go about our lives. This is encouraging, and you can't encourage harassment without encouraging violence. I'm sorry. This idea that, I'm encouraging people to get in somebody's face, but not necessarily to take a swing at them. Well, that's what happens when you rile up a mob and tell them to go harass someone. Eventually it escalates into violence.
Yeah.
That almost always happens. So to say, well, I'm not encouraging violence, well, yes, you are. That's exactly what you're doing. And the left is doing it. It's their media, it's their politicians, it's their op-ed writers, it's celebrities in Hollywood. I mean, you just had Peter Fonda, and I get it. He's a crackpot. He probably doesn't speak for every Democrat on the planet. Mm-hmm. But this is a guy who clearly had no fear when he suggested that DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen be stripped naked and publicly whipped, and that Donald Trump's 12-year-old son be put in a cage with child rapists. I mean, this is the thing that the man actually said. We've gone beyond. I heavily disagree with you. This is why you're wrong.
Well, on the same
out insanity.
But Brittany, along the same lines, and I've got to get going here. But when people say their immediate comeback is the words and the statements and the tweets of the president as a rationalization as to why people do things like this, is there a cause and effect in your mind between what Trump does, what Trump says, and how people react?
So I have long since held that I am not a fan of how the president tweets and a lot of the things that he said. He was a little cringeworthy on the campaign trail. I think he's toned down a little bit on certain things since actually taking the office. But he does. He is a loose cannon when it comes to how he tweets and the things that he says, and I don't agree with a lot on that side either. But I will say this. As much as the president has said a lot of things that I disagree with and has said a lot of things in ways that I disagree with, and you can correct me if you've seen something that I haven't, but I don't recall him standing there and telling people to every single time, some Democrat steps out of their house, I want you to make them fear for their life and make them, run and hide and be afraid to send their children to school because you're going to harass the mess out of them all day long. I don't recall that. I will also say this. Look, if the president says something that makes you that viscerally angry and your immediate response is to go start being violent, that says just as much, if not more, about you than it does about him. Yeah, you have the choice of whether or not you're going to go be violent.
Try yoga and meditation.
Yeah, exactly. Just woosah, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, and maybe have a drink. It's going to be okay.
Hey, Brittany, thank you so much for joining me. Fantastic stuff, and I look forward to talking again.
Thanks for having me. I'll be back anytime.
Thanks, Brittany. Again, thank you to Brittany Hughes. Good stuff. Hopefully we're all a little bit smarter, or at least a little bit more aware. Time now to get into our unsafe sports. Something else happened this week. Not always a real news-crushing event. The NBA had their draft. We'll show you just through 1 through 10, and I'll list 10. But honestly, if you're not in the top 5 or 6, you might not even be drafting somebody that's going to be on your team next year, much less somebody that's going to impact you. It's one of the things that makes the NBA draft so different. No surprise with Ayton going at number 1. You go down this entire list. There were a few trades in there, specifically Atlanta and Dallas, swapping out picks. Doncic goes to Dallas. And yeah, it's hard to say, was that good? Was that bad? I know everybody's got to have an opinion because God knows hot takes are the where it's at. But Trae Young is now a Hawk, and Doncic is now a Mav. Mohamed Bamba, Wendell Carter, a lot of good young talent. Just keep track of these guys that start coming in here around 7 or so, 7, 8. They may indeed make their teams, and from a cost standpoint, they're really not that expensive. The NBA's done a good job of limiting their exposure in that regard. To me, I think the biggest story the last few days that's come out, Tyler Hilinski was a quarterback who had played some for Mike Leach at Washington State. He was 21 years old, and he recently committed suicide, took his own life. His family approached the Mayo Clinic to study his brain and find out what was going on with their son, if there was any neurodegenerative changes in their son's brain. And they found out that he was diagnosed with stage 1 CTE. People that tested the brain said he had the brain of a 65-year-old man. Now, this is not a blanket indictment on the game of football, but it is a heads up to parents out there. It is a heads up to people that want to keep saying that young kids, as in 8 to 14, 15 years old, need to be banging their heads all the time. They really don't. Is football the cause of this? No one can tell you that for absolute certain. But we do know that repetitive head blows, along with concussions and things like that, TBIs, do go a long way. There's a whole chain of these neurodegenerative diseases, whether it's CTE, Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, go down the list. It's terrible. They're tragic. And we have to find the best way to mitigate these things and the best way to diagnose and stop these things. That's it for Unsafe Spaces Sports. Now, we're going to move on right now to sort of a theme this week was half crazy. You know, there was the guys out in the conservative side, the wacky liberals, the stupid statements. But in a week full of stupid statements, this one takes the cake. So as mentioned, we'll take a look here at Maxine and sort of what she had to say. It was a little bit on the, well, let's be honest, it's card carrying, just full speed, bat poop crazy. Maxine, Take it away.
If you think we're rallying now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Already, you have members of your cabinet that have been booed out of restaurants, who have protesters taking up at their house, who saying no peace, no sleep. We're going to win this battle because while you try and quote the Bible, Jeff Sessions and others, you really don't know the Bible. God is on our side. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome.
Oh, bye. Maxine, you need to take your old, washed up butt to bed. Something is wrong with you. You got the mind of a Pop-Tart. You really sitting up here promoting hate. Are you serious? You are promoting hate. You know what, Dr. Ben Carr said? You need to do what you do best, and you need to perform surgery on Maxine Waters. You need to take them marbles and them marshmallows out of her head right now. And you know what, y'all? If Susan Rice would have been kicked out of a restaurant like Sarah Sanders, people would have been acting a plum fool. It would have been all kind of rage going on. And you know what? If Condoleezza Rice would have got on stage like Humpty Dumpty, fell off the wall, Maxine, and said people should turn away, people that work for the Obama administration, oh, it would have been hell. People would have been protesting and acting a dang fool and would have been screaming racism. Maxine is promoting hate and political segregation. And she knows she wrong, talking about harassed Trump officials at a gas station. Girl, you trying to start a war.
Terrence Williams. He's something. She's something. But I get a kick out of him. I find him not only thought-provoking at times, but usually pretty damn funny. All right? You know, we've had a lot of discussions, the right, the left, all these other stories that we've gone over today. But on Feel Good Story, I want to be sure we're looking at things the right way. Let's cue this segment up.
Wow, I feel good. So good, I got you.
Now this is not a very long segment. It's going to be extremely short. It's got nothing to do with conservative crazies. It's got nothing to do with whack job liberals. But I'll tell you what, this nurse, he's doing it right. And he's bringing a little joy into a life. And you can tell the difference it makes. Check this out. You want to see how to interact with people? You want when people say, let's be civil? Look at that as an example. Because goodness knows over the last half hour, 40 minutes or so, we've seen plenty of examples of not being civil. That'll do it. Want to remind you where you can find Unsafe Spaces. You go to YouTube, go to SoundCloud, go to iTunes, Facebook, Twitter, go to randycross.com, unsafespacesusa.com, and any questions or comments you might have, send those to producer at unsafespacesusa.com. Time now for us to go away, but in the meantime, to you, happy trails.
Happy trails to you until we meet again.
Who cares about the clouds when we're together?
Just sing a song and think about sunny weather.
Happy trails to you till we meet again.